So good afternoon and welcome, and thanks to Collins for asking me to think about this topic and then to share my thinking with everybody this afternoon. Because I do think it's a really important one. Increasingly over the years, I think parents have come to value what a good preschool, a good kindergarten experience can offer their children. And across the world, ministries of education and governments seem to turn to the preschool, the kindergarten, to be a solution to some of the issues that are facing societies, including falling literacy rates, school dropout, and then in terms of schools themselves, perhaps underperformance of students and failure at high school levels. So, you know, what exactly constitutes a strong foundation is an important question for all of us. My connection with Collins, just in case you're wondering what it is that I was one of the authors, part of the author team on this foundation series for kindergarten. So that's kind of my link. Okay, so let's just jump straight in. When I was thinking about the term foundation, I started looking around and seeing the different ways in which it's used, and it's a term that comes from engineering, and interestingly it refers obviously to the structure that is beneath the ground of a building. It's the part of the structure of a building that gives it stability. It's the bit that can't be seen, but that's critically important in terms of anchoring the really nice fancy bit that you can see. And what was interesting to me is that as I thought about it, it's just like curriculum developers seem to have adopted this attitude towards the early years as well. It seems to be regarded in all the curricula across the world as putting in place the solid foundation for which later learning happens. So the focus in all our curricula is about preparing children for learning later on, preparing for them for the real thing. So really in service of the upper grades in school, rather than focusing on this incredibly unique and important phase of children's learning and development. So really what we're seeing then is this like trickle-down effect from the higher grades and society at large, based right down into the curricula that we have to use in our classrooms. So what is the challenge then for early years teachers? Well, it's twofold really. It's to create, most importantly, the optimum conditions for learning, so that children are able to achieve what has been set out for them. And in order to do this, we need to have this whole regime of behaviors that we can use. And we need to be establishing environments which encourage, support, and nurture learning. And in order to do that, I would argue, we fundamentally need to understand how the human brain works. What we are equipped with in terms of what we are officially given is a curriculum that provides a series of learning outputs or things that children have to be able to know or do at the end of a certain period. And these are across a wide range of subject areas or disciplines. So early years teachers have to be specialists in a number of things because we're focusing on languages, maths, science, and various other things as well. What's common about the curricula that we use is a focus that has changed over the last 10 years. But the focus is the same whether you are using a traditional curriculum, which some countries use. And so that would be based on things like content, knowledge, information, skills. That's the sort of vocabulary that would be around in the documents that you use. Or if perhaps you are using a curriculum that is based on an outcomes model of education, then the sorts of terminology terminology that will be familiar to you are things like outcomes and competencies, standards, benchmarks, attainment targets, inputs and outputs. But as I said, all of these curricula actually have seen a shift in the last 10 years in a focus which is much more on what is called a skills-based model of learning, or a back to basics approach. And underlying this kind of thinking about curriculum is an understanding of learning as something which is linear. So there's definitely a starting point, and children progress all the way up, and then they reach the end point. There's no moving around. It's from here, things progress from here to there. And linked to this is also an understanding that there's a hierarchy of skills and a hierarchy of knowledge. So what is understood by that is things move from the simple to the complex, things move from part to whole. And a good example of this would be the way in which early reading is taught. So if you think about it, in most schools across the world, what happens is children are first taught to recognize sounds for the letters that they are introduced to. And then they learn to be able to work with blends. And then when they've worked with blends, they learn to read words. And then when they can do all of that fairly quickly and efficiently, and the terms for that are often used, you may know them, automaticity and fluency. When they've achieved those, then they are allowed to move on to reading sentences and paragraphs and books. And so they're able to focus then on reading for meaning. So that's the hierarchy that exists in our reading, the teaching of reading in most schools. And obviously, alongside of this goes a lot of graded readers in the case of reading, but in the case of all things, graded activities. And as I said earlier, a focus on moving from the small parts to the whole. Now, it's not to say that the curriculum that we get to work with are not interesting and don't have some really strong points. But the major constraint about them is that they do not actually align with the way in which children's brains work. So it then falls upon us as teachers in the classroom to find some way of taking what the curriculum wants us to do with children and the way in which children's brains actually work and the human brain generally works, and to bring those two closer together. But the really good news is that we don't actually have to build a foundation for learning, because at birth we come equipped with it. Our brain is this human learning machine, and it's primed for learning. It comes pre-built, existing from the moment of birth. So there's no ways that a child will not learn. And there's no ways that you can make learning happen, but you can be an obstacle to learning instead of helping it along. And so understanding the way in which the brain works helps you to ensure that you are an enabler of learning rather than an obstacle. And Alison Gopnik in her work talks about it. She says, we do not have to make children learn, we just have to let them learn. And her work is something you may want to find out more about if you're not familiar with her. She's a professor of psychology and internationally recognized as a leader in understanding child learning and development. She runs this incredible lab at Berkeley University in the United States, where they study young children's minds and how they think and how they learn. And her work is really interesting to explore some more. You'll find TED Talks available, I think even one on Google. And she's written a couple of books as well, popular books, so they're not full of academic language. They're really accessible and very interesting to read. What I'm going to share with you now is drawing on three different fields. One is evolutionary biology, the other is developmental psychology, and then there is also a field of neuroscience called integrated neuroscience. And what I'm sharing with you now draws on all of these. So let's just get stuck into this magnificent brain of ours. So the first thing that we really need to understand as teachers is that our brains are highly plastic. So all parts of our brains are connected to each other and messages fire back and forth at great speed. And we're not even aware that this is happening. And these millions of messages are called neural connections. And it's the neural connections, that network of neural connections that people are talking about when they talk about your brain's wiring. And our brains are able to rewire themselves throughout the course of our lives. And it's the experiences that we have and the factors in our surroundings, our environmental factors, that in fact shape this wiring. And they shape it and they reshape it. And what is phenomenal about that is that it gives us incredible power as teachers, because the kinds of interactions that we have with the children in our classes and the sorts of environments that we set up for them to learn in are the things that can fundamentally change their wiring. Part of what we also need to remember is that what is used is reinforced and what is unused is pruned. So if you think about it, our brains are a bit like massive filing cabinets. And when we file things in there, we only keep that which we use very often. Anything else is pruned, chucked out, thrown away during the process of sleep, actually, which is why sleep is so important in terms of maintaining your filing cabinet. The other thing that's really critical for us to understand is that our brains are at their most plastic when you are between the ages of 0 and 10 years. So that means that during this very early phase of childhood, all these neural connections are being laid down at a massive speed. They will continue to be laid down throughout our lives, but much slower as we get older. And you can think about it in terms of an example of language learning. If you think how quickly babies and young children learn language, and how much longer and with so much more effort it takes us as we get older, you can see there how the neural connections are forming more slowly as we grow older. So as it turns out, all of those people who decided that the early years, kindergartens and preschools, are the place where we need to focus our energies if we want to intervene in children's learning, actually turned out to be correct. The next thing that I want to share with you, which I think is really important, thinking and understanding the children that are in front of us, is the way that young children focus. And the way that children between the ages of 0 and 5 focus is very different to the way in which adults focus. And this work is drawing on the studies that Alison Gottnick has done. And what she's discovered is that adults have this very spotlight focus. It focuses on one thing and it manages to filter out a whole lot of other things that might be interesting but are not immediately relevant. So it's like the spotlight up here. We are able as adults to really focus our attention on something. And here in this illustration here with the arrow, so focusing straight down onto something. Children between the ages of 0 and 5 focus in a very different way. She uses the analogy of a lantern and calls it more like a lantern focus. So if you can imagine a lantern, so a light that has glass right the way around it, so that it throws out a light more in a circular way. This is the way that children's minds focus between the ages of 0 and 5. As they get older, they move gradually towards a more spotlight focus. But the children that are in our classes have very much this lantern kind of focus. And this is because it's biologically evolution in terms of evolutionary biology. This is entirely as it should be, because our brains are there to ensure that we survive. And if you think of long ago, people living out in the wild, young children needing to learn how to survive, it wouldn't have been really useful if all they did was focus on, let's say, berry picking as a source of food. And they didn't do anything else. What they need to do is they need to focus more broadly. They need to pick up information much more broadly from an environment in order to survive. So our brains, in terms of evolution, are absolutely primed for us to have this focus. We are primed so that as children, we are taking in all the information that we need in order to survive in our environment. The question then is, so what does this mean for us as teachers in classrooms with children? How do we approach what we do with them? How do we think about what we do with them? Before I start on this, I just want to make it quite clear that I'm not doing an either-or thing. I'm not saying we mustn't do this and we must do that. I'm really more suggesting that we need to have a less of a focus on some things and more of a focus on other things, because they align with what children's brains are doing and with what they need in terms of what they're going to have to do later on in the school. So the first thing I want to suggest is that we spend less time on pen and paper activities and more time giving children opportunities to explore. And when I mean pen and paper activities, I'm really referring to worksheet and workbook activities. I'm in no way saying that we shouldn't be doing those at all, but really their place needs to be after children have had physical opportunities to do explorations of different concepts. So to come at the end of a series of learning opportunities, rather than to be the way that children learn about a new concept. And also then a less of a focus from our point of view on what it is that children have to learn, and to think more about what is it about this concept that I think is for children, that is important for children to explore. So for example, if you're thinking about two-dimensional shapes, a curriculum might say things like children have to be able to recognize a triangle and a circle and a rectangle and a square. But the question for us is, what is it about two-dimensional shapes and about shape as a concept that I think is important for children to be able to explore? It's not terribly helpful to be able to recognize those things. It's much more useful for children to be able to explore the concept of shape, to be able to explore the concept of how two-dimensional and three-dimensional shapes relate to each other. And in that process, because it's a meaning-making process for children, they will just automatically, with frequent exposure, learn the names of those shapes that we need them to, because that's in the curriculum. Excuse me. So the next thing I want to focus on is perhaps a less of a focus on adult-directed activities. And what I mean here are two types of activities. One where really what the adult is doing is talking at or lecturing children. So perhaps the moments where you're telling them all about weather or telling them all about the planets. If you think again about how children's focus is lantern-like, the chances of them being able to focus on what you're saying for anything more than around 3 minutes is is relatively little. So, you know, you're going to lose them. They're not going to be focused. So it's much better to keep it short, sharp, and sweet, and rather to be providing more opportunities for children to explore the things that you are introducing them to in a short little talk about something. The other thing to think about is, if you are having to take children step by step through an activity, and by this I mean, if you have to tell them to do this, and then you have to tell them to do that, and then you have to tell them to do the next thing, so they're not able to move more or less independently through an activity, then the chances are that there's a mismatch between the children's interests and what they're able to do and the activity that you are offering them. What we really need are more opportunities where children have the freedom to explore things. So if you think of an example of perhaps learning about push and pull forces, maybe you want children to understand the concept of force, and you want them to really get to grips with what a push force is as opposed to a pull force, and be able to differentiate between those two things. If you do a workbook activity where you have to take them through it, and they have to identify, this picture shows a push force, this picture shows a pull force, without any real experience of that, it's fairly meaningless for them, and it's very difficult for them to understand. Rather, to give them multiple opportunities to explore the same thing. So what you might do is set up a kind of learning station or activity station in your classroom where they're able to play with a road mat and different toy cars that they can push and pull along the road, or you can even mark out a road using tape on a mat for them. So that would be one thing. And then another opportunity somewhere else in your classroom where perhaps you've got some boxes that are filled with quite heavy objects, and you ask the children if they can think of how to move those boxes from one side of the classroom to another side of the classroom without picking them up. Can they think of how to do that? And then perhaps another station where they're just empty cardboard boxes that children can work with a partner to have one child sitting in the box, and then for them to work out how to get that child in the box from one side of the classroom to the other side of the classroom. So all of these will give children first-hand experience of pushing and pulling forces, and help to really develop the concepts of these things. And one of the things that I find useful from a Froebelian approach, which is based on the work of Friedrich Froebel, who actually worked in the 1800s, is this concept of freedom with guidance. So just an aside, the Froebel Trust has a really useful website where you can find a whole lot of resources that are useful for early years classrooms, and a lot of that work was considered revolutionary at the time that Froebel was around, but today it's just seen as sort of regular but good classroom practice for the early years. So do pop over there and have a look. But this concept of freedom with guidance, I think, is a very useful one. So the idea is that what we do is we give children freedom of choice, because freedom of choice enables them to experience the consequences of the choices that they make. And when children experience the consequences of the choices they make, either on their own or with a group of other children, then they are developing an understanding of the causal relations in the world. And this is a really important scientific way of thinking. Children do it automatically when they are trying to find meaning in the world and trying to work out how things work. But giving them the freedom of choice speeds that up, helps that to happen. So it's not about just letting children do whatever they want to do, but it is about offering gentle guidance that helps focus them. So, so think about a situation in a classroom where perhaps a child is trying to build a tower with blocks. And what she's done is she's put the small blocks at the bottom and she's trying to build this really tall tower, and she's got very long blocks on the top, and of course the tower keeps falling down. One way that you could respond to that is by saying, oh, look, let me show you how to do that. And then you could actually build it for her. That would not be freedom with guidance. That would sort of be offering a quick fix solution. Another way would be saying something like, I don't know if you know, but like, it's never going to work if you put the big things at the top. You have to put the big ones at the bottom and the small ones at the top, and then it'll work. Again, that's offering a solution, offering a quick fix intervention. When you're using freedom with guidance, what you would do is make a suggestion to the child that the child is then able to choose to take on board or not. So something like, I wonder what would happen if you started with the bigger blocks at the bottom. And then the child can choose whether or not to pick up on your suggestion or to carry on doing what they were doing until eventually they get frustrated and then change, or another child comes along and works with them. So it's about not jumping in and fixing things. It's about sort of offering, well, I wonder if, and what if, or could this work? So it's about suggestion as a form of guidance. The other thing that we need to think of doing less of is using observation as a tool for assessment and evaluation of children, and instead as a way of guiding what our next steps with children are going to be. So listening very closely to the conversations that they're having with each other and watching what it is they do as they are busy with their activities to help us know what the next best bit of guidance will be to offer. And when we are supplying children with this rich environment of opportunities to explore concepts, you'll find that there's less of a need for external rewards like stickers and stars, because children are intrinsically feeling satisfied by their learning. They don't need an external reward. They are just feeling intrinsically satisfied by what it is they're doing. Let's focus now. So just offering you some picture of the sorts of activity that I'm suggesting with these more exploratory opportunities to learn about concepts. So I want to focus now on another part of our brains that's really important for us as early years teachers. And this is the basic affective systems that our brains come wired with. So at birth, we have both a cognitive system, so one that focuses on thinking, and affective systems as well. And we have 7 different kinds of affective systems. And these affective systems give rise to what you and I would call our emotions. And there's an interplay between these 2 systems. They affect each other, they work together to shape our thinking, to shape our learning. So what happens is the affective system gives rise to what is called feelings, and then later on these become emotions. So in neuropsychology, feelings and emotions are not the same things. Feelings are the things that arise unconsciously from the fact that we have this affective wiring system in our brain. Emotions occur as we mature. Emotions are feelings that we can recognize, we can name, we can describe. So that's a bit of a developmental process. Let me give you an example. One of the affective systems is called separation distress. And you can see this operating with very young babies. If you think of a baby maybe up to a month, 2 months old, if the mother moves out of eyeshot, moves out of the room, the baby cries. The baby cries because the baby has no yet cognitive sense, doesn't have the thinking skills yet developed, so not neural connections yet made to recognize that that the mother is going to return, that sometimes that's what happens. So there's permanency attached to it. So what's happening is the baby cries because their separation distress system is kicking in. So it's an automatic reaction. It's an automatic response to a stimulus in the environment. There's no ways that that baby recognizes, oh my goodness, I feel alone, I feel abandoned. When's my mother coming back? It's just an automatic kick in. So that's the way that feelings operate. And then as we mature, we find the language and we develop the neural connections to be able to recognize and describe these. And it's the emotions that are very important in our thinking. In fact, they shape our thinking. And so they shape our learning, because what emotions do is they decide what it is that you're going to pay attention to. Because remember, you've got a whole lot of stimuli coming at you all the time. And what you focus in on is what is driven by your emotions. I'm going to focus now on 2 of these 7 underlying systems that are particularly important for our work with children in classrooms. And the first one is called the seeking system. And the seeking system is central to our urge to explore and understand. It's about seeking meaning. So the way the brain works is that there's all these stimuli in the world around us, in our environment, and they come into our brain via our sense organs. So our sense organs are just like an open window letting all the stimuli in. And then we just got completely bombarded by all of this information that's coming at us. And there's absolutely no ways that one could process it all quickly enough in order for the brain to be efficient. So what it does instead is it filters the information. And it filters the information by using prediction and selection. So what it does is your brain is focused, is thinking about a particular thing. You're thinking about something particular, and it predicts from what is coming in what is going to be the most relevant for you, and then selects that stimuli and adds that into what you already know about something, what you already can do. So it's adding on. And what happens is that the brain chunks the information again. So it chops it up into chunks. And the reason it does this is because that creates patterns, and that makes it easier to retrieve from the memory later. So if you think about our brains as these, our memories in our brains as these great big filing cabinets. In a filing cabinet, you don't just chuck everything in, and well, hopefully you don't, and then when you try and find something, it's all a mess. What you've got is you've got separate files where you put things that belong together in the same file, and our memory is exactly like that. So our brain will see patterns between things, and what it will do is it will chunk it together so that it can be easily retrieved from the memory when we need it later. All of this indicates that meaning is at the heart of what it is to be human. The seeking system is focused on meaning. Meaning is not something that we start to focus on later in life. It is there from day one. We exist to make meaning. And this is really important in terms of the experiences that we offer children in our classrooms. What I'd like to do now to try and demonstrate more practically some of these things to you is just get you to do a short task. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 4 different slides. I'll show them for a little bit, one at a time, and then I'm going to take it away And what I want you to do is to recall for yourself, you can say it out loud if you like, recall for yourself exactly what was on that slide in exactly the same order that you saw it. And then we'll look at what processing was happening with that a little bit later. Okay, so here come the 4 slides. So let's do this. Okay, here's the first one. Okay, recall that. Here comes the next one. Okay, recall that. Slide number 3. Recall it. And slide number 4. And recall that. Okay, so let's unpack a little bit what was going on there. So to start off by saying that on each of those 4 slides, there were 26 letters. So it's not like one had more or fewer than another. The other thing to note is that this task would have been impossible if you were not a speaker of English. And obviously, if you are a home language speaker of English, or you are a very skilled second language speaker of English, then you're going to be drawing on your knowledge of the language in order to complete the tasks. So it's not like if you'd never spoken English before, you could do any of this. You're drawing on what you already know about the grammar of the language, about the sounds of the language, about how letters appear in the language as you do these tasks. So you probably found that number 1 was the most difficult to remember. And the reason for that is that is a random arrangement of letters. There's no meaning. So when your brain looks at it, it looks at it and you're trying to work out some kind of pattern. There is no pattern. And so that is the most difficult one to remember. Just a side note, just remember that that's the sort of activity that we are asking of children when we hold up flashcards with a letter on them. Okay, so this is the smallest part in terms of a part to a whole. It has no meaning attached to it. So it's the most difficult task for children to do. And it's the most difficult task for our brains as adults to do as well. The next one you probably worked out is the 26 letters of the alphabet in order conventionally that the alphabet appears in. So the chances are that what you did was looked at it, recognized the pattern, and then went, oh, right, that's the alphabet. And then you didn't have to remember each letter in sequence because you already know it. So what your brain could do is retrieve what the information is when you had to do the recall. You could retrieve the information that you've already stored, which is attached to the symbol in your filing cabinet called the alphabet. So that's a really good example of the way in which pattern is so important for us. And it's particularly useful for recall, and symbol is useful for recall. In the third one, you probably found this easier than the first one because the 26 letters are patterned together into words. So most probably what happened is you used prediction. So you look at the thing and you imagine, oh, this is going to be a sentence because of the way it appears on the page. You then read the first word, horses, and like, okay, is that a mistake? No, and leave. And then you work out card eats, oh, these words, these are just words. There actually is no relationship with them. So it's easier to read because the words themselves are meaningful, but it's more difficult to read and remember than 4, where the whole sentence is meaningful. So number 4, letters arranged into words, words arranged into a sentence that has meaning. So much easier to remember. Your brain can cope with that so much quicker than it can cope with any of the other options in 1 and in 3. And this is really important, because what it means is that the part to whole is actually really difficult for children's brains. So when we are working with children, introducing them to literacy, encouraging them to develop concepts of reading and writing, beginning to start to read and write themselves perhaps, we need fewer of these sorts of activities, which are extremely difficult because they are without context for children. Remember that children don't have the big picture yet of how reading and writing work. They're still working that out. So it's quite hard to focus on the little bits. It's much easier for them to focus on something that is meaningful. And so coming across letters and words and numbers that are based in stories and rhymes and songs and drawing and pretend writing is a much easier way for children to access and develop their literacy knowledge. So we're talking about more writing and drawing examples like this. So rather than coloring in their own pictures, because that is a meaningful, that's a meaningful activity for them. They're putting the meaning into it. Or as in this example here on this side of the screen, using their pretend writing and drawing in the same at the same time together, and here doing their own pretend writing. These are really very important literacy development activities for children. And then in terms of reading, what is critically important is reading to children and giving them opportunities to explore books just on their own together and individually. And my colleague, Carol Bloch, I think offers a really useful perspective on this. She says children entranced by stories find the energy and commitment to learn how print works and how to shape it for themselves because they want to use it. In other words, it's meaningful to them. They sense its social power for them. So really important to offer those meaningful, meaning-based activities for children as they learn to read and write. I just briefly want to touch on another one of the affective systems that we have in play at birth, and that is the play system. So we basically, all mammals are programmed to play. And this play system is a physical social engagement system in which we experiment and explore. And it doesn't matter whether we're a lion cub, a tiger cub, elephant calf, or a human baby. Playing is what we do. And it's critical to children's learning and development. And I think most preschool teachers obviously know that. It's an opportunity to learn, to change the wiring, and it's an opportunity to learn adult behaviors. So it's a very important part of survival, and it's kind of our go-to survival mechanism. Children obviously play in a number of different ways, and all of these are important because play in all its forms offers a meaningful context for imitation, imagination, problem solving, and creativity. It's through particular forms of play, though, that children develop a capacity for symbolic behavior. And symbolic behavior is critically important to their success at literacy and maths, because you have to understand how symbol works in order to be able to read and write and do maths. And this is so because if you look at this, all of these things on this slide are symbols. The word numbers is a symbol for those numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And they themselves are symbols for different quantities of something. The question mark and the exclamation mark are symbols that tell us what a speaker intended, what a writer intended with the sentence that has come before them. The child's drawing, the child understands when they do that drawing that this is not actually me, but it's a representation of me. It's how I see me. And likewise with the circle and the word circle itself. So it's really important that children grasp this, and it's actually through play that they're able to do this, and through symbolic play. And they practice symbolic behavior when they're doing things like drawing and painting. And also, if you notice in the photograph at the bottom of the screen, children there practicing symbolic behavior during a sort of technology building activity, science activity, because the boxes that are covered with brick-like paper are symbols or are representing real bricks, and their actions are representing the act of building a wall. If they're not actually building a wall, they are symbolically building a wall. And then if you look in these pictures, here are other examples of children using pretend play now as a way of building their understanding of how symbols work. So in the middle picture and the picture down the bottom here, children using a flip-flop, a shoe, to stand for, to represent a mobile phone, and then their actions imitating the adult behavior, representing the adult behavior of taking the selfie. In this one, the children were playing at being on the bus. So the chairs representing the seats in the bus, this little girl feeding her baby, of course the doll then representing the baby, and here the leaves and the stones representing the animal's food, and this fluffy toy representing the actual animal in the game. So sometimes we can think about pretend play as a thing that children just do at home, or the thing that we can find time for when children have finished with the real work of the day. But we need to understand its critical role in terms of some of the conceptual development that needs to happen in the early years, and really carve out good chunks of time where children can practice this kind of behavior. So to finish up then, what are the essential ingredients, am I suggesting, that make up a strong foundation for children's success? And I really think it's about what we do. So it's about us working with, rather than against, the way in which children's brains naturally operate, the way in which nature, biology, has programmed them to work. It's about trusting that actually you can't help it, but actually children are going to learn because that's what brains do. And then, and so relaxing and allowing them some freedom to choose in the activities that we offer them, while offering gentle guidance that helps them to learn more and to discover more deeply the sorts of things that we'd like them to. And then offering a very rich and interesting environment that engages them, that makes them want to explore and develop their understanding. And most importantly, to ensure that our classrooms offer learning opportunities that are meaningful to the children in them, less worried about whether they're meaningful to us, and do the children find them meaningful. And I'd like to just finish up with a quote from Alison Gopnik, because I think she says it so magnificently. She says, we should not be making preschool more academic, more like school. It should be the other way around. Thanks very much.
We've had a few questions through. So the first one was, some students tend to cry if they can't see their class teacher, even when they are 5 to 6 years old. What can be done to help this?
Okay, so the first thing to do is to recognize that what's kicking in is that affective system, the separation distress system. So what it means is that actually the child's brain is functioning spot on, its behavior, you know, is doing the work that it needs to do. So that's the first thing. And although we obviously don't want children to be distressed, it's a natural response. So what often helps then is to give children the language, so to help move them from the feeling into the emotion. So give them the language so that they can talk about what it is that they're feeling. Oh, I see you're crying. Is that because you feel scared when you can't see me? And then or you feel afraid, or you feel lonely, is that how you feel? Here's some options for you. And then suggesting that a child could actually get the help of another adult that's available, or pairing that child with a more confident child so that they can be with them when you're not around. So just really help giving them the language to move them simply out of the feeling into the emotion, and then some strategies for coping with it.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've had another question, which they said, how can I adapt my teaching to accommodate when a child's focus starts to narrow? So I know you were talking about the lantern and the spotlight. So is there a sort of a definitive period when they start to switch to the spotlight?
Okay, so maturing happens over a period. So the children that we are generally dealing with in the early years are very much in the lantern phase. So it's not that it looks like, it might look to us, because that's how our brains focus, that they're focusing, but focusing on something else. It's not really that, it's that they've gone, their brains have gone somewhere else. And so I think maybe the idea is how to bring them back again. So physical activity is a really good way of keeping children engaged. So asking them to sit still and listen to you is the most difficult thing. I mean, it's even difficult for us as adults to do that. So to ask that of children for only incredibly short periods of time. I was chatting to an occupational therapist recently, and she said to me, and I found this really a helpful guide. She said that generally speaking, you can use a child's chronological age to work out how long they can concentrate if sitting still for, or on a single activity. If they're moving around and doing things, that's very different. But a sitting still task, either at a desk or listening to you, you can use a child's chronological age as a really good guide, as that's the maximum period that they can actually listen to you for. So I think the thing is actually to provide, to do that kind of thing as little as possible in the classroom, and to rather provide more opportunities where you're engaging perhaps one-to-one with children as they're working on something.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Thank you. We've had another question through. Someone has asked, how can I adapt some of your suggestions to online teaching, perhaps some of the activities?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's really difficult with young children, because online focus is very different, very difficult for children, very young children, because if they're just receiving it via an online mechanism. I have to be honest with you, I would find that quite a challenge. I think again, though, if you are doing things with children online and you're teaching directly, to break up things with periods of physical activity. So to get children to move away from the screen, to go and fetch X, and to physically do things, physical movement, anything that involves whole body, anything that involves all the senses, is a great way of trying to get children hold their attention and keep them engaged in the task.